There is a particular kind of exhaustion that sleep cannot touch. It does not live in your muscles. It lives in the place where you used to keep your hope. You wake up, you move through the motions, you say the words you are supposed to say, but there is a quiet, persistent whisper beneath the floorboards of your mind that asks, who exactly is living this life? Because it no longer feels like me. If you have felt this hollowing out, this specific ache of being a stranger in your own existence, do not click away. This is not a motivational speech. This is a map for navigating the terrain you are currently standing in, even if it feels like you are standing in rubble. There comes a point where the architecture of your life, the beliefs, the routines, the identities you constructed brick by brick, suddenly feels less like a home and more like a cage with the door welded shut. Everything that once held you upright begins to tremble. Not just the big pillars like career or marriage, but the subtle ones. The story you told yourself about being the strong one, the comfort you took in being easygoing, the pride you felt in never needing help. And here is the unsettling truth that most people run from their entire lives. The terror is not just about what is crumbling around you. It is about the cracking sound coming from within you. It is the sound of a shell that took decades to harden suddenly becoming too small for the thing growing inside it. If you are in that season where the old map is useless and the new horizon is just fog, listen closely. This breakdown you are experiencing may not be evidence that you are failing at life. It may be the first honest sound your soul has made in years. It is the revolt against a false peace. According to the depth psychology of Carl Jung, a human being does not stumble into consciousness by merely rearranging the furniture of their thoughts or chanting affirmations at the mirror. The door to a genuine life swings open only when you stop trying to fix the surface and dare to descend into the basement. It is there, in the damp dark, where the unhealed wounds and the rejected versions of you have been running the projector of your life, without your permission. When the pressure is at its most unbearable, understand this: the old self is not dying quietly. It is thrashing. It knows its tenure is up. So do not mistake this intense friction for a sign to stop. It is a sign that you are close. And in just a moment, we are going to strip away the vague spiritual platitudes and look directly at the mechanism of why you feel like you are being unmade. Why the urge to surrender is strongest precisely when you are on the verge of a breakthrough, and what it actually looks like when an identity dies, so that a person can finally be born. Stay with me. Part 1. The Unwilling Architect of the Soul. When people stumble upon the concept of being called to something deeper, the imagination often conjures up images of divine favoritism. A spotlight from the universe. A golden ticket that makes the line move faster. We think of the chosen as those who are insulated from the mundane misery of the rest of the world. But Jung's perspective dismantles this fantasy entirely. To be marked by the call of the self is not to receive a shield from suffering. It is, quite often, to lose the ability to tolerate the anesthetic that numbs everyone else. It is a peculiar kind of exile. You look around and see others who seem perfectly content to replay the same loop. Wake up, consume, react, sleep, repeat. They wear their social masks so long that the mask fuses with the skin. They don't hear the groaning of the foundation. But you do. You cannot unhear it. For the person in the grip of this inner summons, living out of alignment with their essential nature is not just uncomfortable. It is a biological and psychological crisis. The system overheats. The engine seizes. You find yourself unable to digest the very same circumstances you swallowed without issue a year ago. Why? Because the center of gravity has shifted. Jung identified a core within the human psyche that is not the voice of your resume, your appetite, or your insecurities. He called it the self. The self is not the I that wants a bigger house or fears rejection at a party. The self is the blueprint. It is the original, unwounded image of who you were before the world told you who you had to be. and some people cannot escape its gravity. They try to dissolve into the group, but the mixture rejects them. They try to find rest in the pre-packaged narratives of success, the spouse, the car, the promotion, and yet, there is a restlessness in the bones, a question that hangs in the air of every quiet room. Is this the actual menu, or just the picture on the wall? This is not arrogance. It is not a belief that one is better than others. It is a different operating system. It is the heavy burden of being unable to lie to yourself for extended periods of time. You may have felt this your entire life without a name for it. The sensation of standing in a crowded room and feeling an invisible pane of glass between you and the laughter. You smile. You nod. You perform the rituals of belonging. Yet a part of you is always standing just outside the window, watching the party, wondering why the air in there feels so thin. You might have built a life that looks impeccable from the street view. The lawn is manicured. The windows are clean. Society gives you a thumbs up. But inside, you are wearing clothes that don't fit your own skin. You are suffocating in the approval of others. This is the signature of the inner call. You have developed a severe allergy to the counterfeit. Not just the lies other people tell, but the lies you tell yourself to get through the day. Most people can endure a soul-crushing routine for 40 years, if the pension is decent and the neighbors are jealous. They can tolerate a connection that is emotionally bankrupt as long as the public narrative remains intact. But the one who is being pulled by the self does not have that luxury of numbness. Every act of self-betrayal registers as a small death. It is like having perfect pitch in a world of people who are tone deaf. One false note, and your entire being recoils. You feel yourself diminishing. This is why the crises come earlier. They cut deeper, and they often arrive when, by all external metrics, you should be happy. If this resonates, stop diagnosing yourself as broken, overly sensitive, or difficult. Stop trying to file down the edges of your soul so you fit into a drawer that was never meant for you. The exhaustion you carry is not a sign of weakness. It is the fatigue of holding your breath for 20 years. You are not being called to the podium to receive an award. You are being called to the foundry to be melted down and recast into something real. And reality has a cost. It demands the dismantling of the safe, the lifeless, and the beautiful lies. So, before we step further into the dark, anchor this. The chosen one in Jungian terms is not a crown for the ego. It is the burden of those who can no longer hit the snooze button on their own existence. Part 2. The battle beneath the floorboards. We are taught to scan the horizon for enemies. We believe the threat to our peace is external. It's the economy. It's the partner who doesn't see us. It's the boss who undervalues us. It's the past that wounded us. And let me be clear, those things are real. They leave scars. But Jung pointed to a layer of the tragedy that is far more difficult to swallow because it removes the luxury of being just a victim. There is a war being waged. Yes, but the front line is not in your living room or your office. The front line is in the unconscious. What devastates us most persistently is not the event itself, but what the event activates in the basement of our psyche. The final confrontation does not begin when the world rejects you. It begins when the darkness inside you refuses to stay sedated. The shadow. We hear the word and we think of evil, of the villain in the movie. But in Jung's map, the shadow is simply the warehouse of the disowned self. It is the massive collection of everything you were told was unacceptable. Some of us learned as children that sadness was a burden to others, so we buried our tears alive. Some of us learned that anger was dangerous, so we strangled our own voice. Some learned that shining too brightly invited attack, so we dimmed our own light until we forgot we had a switch. Piece by piece, we took the most vibrant, raw, and honest parts of our nature and shoved them into a black bag, dragging it behind us, all in the name of survival. It was a necessary adaptation. But the psyche does not allow amputation without consequence. That is why so many people live in a loop of confusion. They look at their history and see the same wreckage repeating. The same type of unavailable person wearing a different face. The same gut-wrenching reaction to a specific tone of voice. The same invisible ceiling they keep hitting in their career. They call it bad luck, or fate. Jung called it the unconscious engineering a confrontation. It is the shadow arranging the furniture so you trip over it in the daylight. Consider this. A woman who despises selfishness with a fiery passion may find herself perpetually drained by takers. She is the martyr. She is the giver. But if we look closely, what she calls hating selfishness might be the shadow's way of hiding a simple, terrifying truth. She has never permitted herself to have a need. She has never allowed the sentence "I don't want to" leave her lips. Her hatred is a projection of her own imprisoned self-interest. Or take the man who is perpetually enraged by arrogance. He sees pretension everywhere, and it makes his blood boil. Yet if he were to sit in silence long enough, he might find that what he truly despises is the graveyard of his own unexpressed desire for recognition. He hates in others the very thing he has forbidden himself to feel. Imagine the psyche as an old manor house. The ground floor is immaculate. That's where you entertain. Yes, I'm fine. No, it's no trouble. I'm just tired. But beneath that polished floor are locked cellars. You don't go down there. You've thrown away the key. But those rooms don't vanish. They have a life of their own. And when the pressure builds, they don't just leak, they flood the ground floor. That flood feels like anxiety. It feels like rage that is disproportionate to the event. It feels like the sudden, inexplicable urge to burn down a life you spent years building. Right now, I want you to be honest. Not with the world, but with the quiet witness inside you. Have you ever caught a glimpse of the fact that the thing tearing you apart isn't the new situation, but an old wound that the new situation just touched? If you can see that, even faintly, you are no longer lost. You are just underground. And if you are ready to stop running from the echo, to stop blaming the echo for the shape of the cave, then you are standing at the entrance of the only work that matters. Jung understood the sinister elegance of the shadow. The more you deny it, the more sophisticated its disguises become. It stops coming at you as a monster. It comes as righteousness. It comes as a reasonable justification for why you are the one who has been wronged. It comes as "I'm just being honest" when you're actually being cruel. It makes you believe you are acting from logic, when you are actually being puppeteered by a terrified child hiding in the dark. They enter every argument with a nuclear arsenal. Not because the topic is that important, but because the conflict has tapped into an aquifer of ancient pain. If someone is silent for 5 minutes, they feel abandoned. If a colleague gets a promotion, they feel erased. If they receive a minor critique, they feel annihilated. These reactions are not happening in the present tense. They are time travelers. They are the echoes of moments when you were too small to understand what was happening, but old enough to remember the feeling. So the battle has never just been about the person standing in front of you. It is a collision between now and then. Between the adult who knows better and the child who is still terrified of the dark. That is why you cannot win this war by changing your address or your relationship status. You can leave the toxic city, but if you don't clean the toxic well inside you, you will poison the next town you move to. You will carry the same gravity into every new orbit. So if your life feels like a war zone, resist the temptation to simplify it into heroes and villains. Yes, there may be villains, but the deeper layer of the work is waiting in the things you don't want to own. The final battle does not ask you to conquer the world. It asks you to stop, turn around, and look at your own darkness without flinching. Because only then will you realize that what has been chasing you is not a predator. It is the abandoned part of you, starving for recognition, demanding to be brought back inside where it belongs. Part 3. The precise timing of the collapse. This is the question that haunts the quiet hours. Why now? Why not 10 years ago when I had more energy to fight? Why not 5 years from now, when maybe I'd be more stable? The timing feels like a cruel joke, but in the architecture of the psyche, there is no such thing as random collapse. Jung observed that a profound crisis tends to manifest at the exact moment when the conscious structure of your life can no longer contain the pressure of the life that wants to be lived. The container is full. The lid is popping off. This battle has appeared now not because you have become weak, but because the old scaffolding of your identity has become too narrow to support the weight of your expanding truth. There are seasons when a person can run on fumes. You can run on duty, on habit, on the memory of who you used to be. But eventually, the soul calls in the debt, and the initial signals are quiet, a fog of emptiness, a sadness that doesn't have a plot, a tiredness that isn't fixed by sleep. You think it's a vitamin deficiency or a need for a vacation. But then the volume increases. The insomnia, the free-floating dread, the sudden repulsion toward the job you used to tolerate, the feeling of being buried alive in the very commitments that once gave you status. This is not the universe punishing you. This is the psyche performing an intervention. It is saying, the version of you that got us here cannot get us there. She has to be retired. Jung viewed the psyche as a self-regulating ecosystem. If you lean too far into logic and rigidity, the unconscious will flood you with emotion and chaos to restore the balance. If you live a life of meek compliance, the wild, assertive part of you that you've caged will start rattling the bars. If you have turned yourself into a productivity machine, the fragile, human, weeping part of you will demand its due. It will demand it at the most inconvenient time. We often romanticize transformation as a gentle awakening, a soft light filling the room. But depth psychology reveals a messier truth. Before the new order is established, the old order fights back with the ferocity of a dying empire. So if you are witnessing the return of old fears you thought you buried, if ancient aches are flaring up, if the foundations of familiar relationships are cracking, do not assume you are regressing. You are likely approaching the threshold. The old ghosts are making one last, desperate stand before they are evicted for good. In the alchemical tradition that Jung studied, there is a phase called the Nigredo, the blackening. It is the moment when everything falls apart. The map is burned. The compass spins. It looks like the end of the world. But for the alchemist, it was the necessary precursor to the gold. It is the phase where the ego, the part of you that thinks it's the CEO of your life, finally admits it has no control over this process. It must surrender to the chaos. It must walk through the fog without knowing where the ground ends. This battle is here now, because something in your present environment has brushed against the exact nerve that the unconscious was waiting to expose. It's like a key you didn't know you were carrying finally finding the lock you've been avoiding. The event in your life right now, the conflict, the loss, the betrayal, it's the trigger, not the cause. The cause is ancient, and once that door swings open, you cannot close it again. You cannot return to the blissful ignorance of your former self. You have seen too much. That is why people who pass through the fire of a deep crisis emerge with different eyes. They are not trying to be difficult or deep. They have simply been rewired. A deeper layer of perception has been switched on, and it does not have an off switch. And let's be clear about one more thing. This battle is here now because you are finally mature enough to survive without the scaffolding of your old illusions. When we are young, we can coast on potential. We can say, someday I'll be real. We can postpone the reckoning. But maturity brings an intolerance for internal hypocrisy. You cannot keep saying you value peace while living in a war zone of your own making. The gap between what you say and how you live becomes too painful to ignore. The same event that was merely annoying at 25 becomes unbearable at 40. Not because you've become weak, but because your soul has raised its standards. So if you're asking why now, perhaps the answer is because a cycle has completed its rotation, because the training wheels have to come off, because the old survival strategies can no longer protect you from the life that is waiting to be claimed. This battle has arrived at this precise moment, because now is the only moment when your old self is finally weak enough to be overthrown. Part 4. The Eulogy of the False Self. There is a disorienting moment in the wilderness where you catch your reflection and do not recognize the person staring back. The things that used to anchor you, the beliefs, the preferences, the reactions, suddenly feel like borrowed clothes. They don't fit. They don't smell like you. And in that void, panic rises. We assume that we are dying. We think the core is rotting. But according to Jung, what is actually in its death throes is not your true nature. It is the structure you built to manage a world you were afraid of. When the crisis hits, the first thing to crumble is usually the persona, the mask, the image you curated to ensure love, safety, and a paycheck. The person who was the responsible one in the family feels an abyss of emptiness when they stop wanting to carry everyone's luggage. The person who lived for the gold star and the validation of achievement faces their first real public failure and realizes they don't know who they are if they aren't winning. That pain is not just about the lost opportunity. It is the pain of an actor realizing they've been on stage so long they've forgotten their own name. Jung was emphatic about this. A great deal of psychological misery stems from living too long inside an image that society applauds, but the soul despises. This is the cruelest irony of all. Sometimes what is dying inside you is precisely the thing other people liked the most about you. You were loved because you were always nice, always accommodating, always the peacemaker. But deep beneath that placid surface, your true nature is not just a still pond. It contains storms. It contains boundaries. It contains the word no. It contains a hunger for something that isn't just pleasant. When the whole self is compressed into the tiny box labeled good person, what begins to die is not the ego. It's the vitality, the life force. Over the years, that armor becomes so thick that even joy can't pierce it. Some of these identities were forged in the fires of childhood survival. They were brilliant, life-saving adaptations. The invisible child who learned that safety meant not being seen. The performer who learned that love was conditional on applause. But what saves you at 7 years old will imprison you at 37. The mechanism that was once a life raft becomes a lead weight. And when the time for maturation arrives, these old identities don't just fade away. They have to be escorted out. And they don't go quietly. So what is dying inside you right now might be a survival instinct that has overstayed its welcome by 3 decades. You are still worshiping a strategy that is no longer relevant. Consider the woman who prided herself on being a fortress. I don't need anyone. It was her badge of honor, her protection against the vulnerability of abandonment. But in the quiet of her own soul, what is dying is not her strength. It is the ice around her longing for connection. It is the thaw. And thawing is painful. It feels like falling apart, but it's actually just water returning to its natural state. Or think of the ideal child who spent a lifetime chasing the approval of parents who are now aging and fading. As the old expectations lose their gravitational pull, they realize they never built a life of their own choosing. They built a monument to someone else's dream. The death of that role feels like a free fall. But it is a necessary demolition, because in the space that is cleared, there is room for a person who may be less admirable by the old metrics, but infinitely more real. If you feel something collapsing, ask a braver question than "What's wrong with me?" Ask, could it be that what is dying is merely the stand-in, the stunt double? Could it be that what is taking its last breath is the mask that never stopped smiling, the armor that never let anyone in, the belief that you had to earn your oxygen? Because if that is the case, then this agony, no matter how fierce, is not a demolition. It is a sacred unbuilding. And perhaps, for the first time in a very long time, what is dying inside you is not the light. It is the wall that has been blocking the sun. And if you're still here, if you've stayed with the discomfort, I want to acknowledge that. It takes a certain kind of courage to not look away. We are halfway through this descent. If this is touching something real in you, let this moment be a marker. Subscribe if you want to walk the rest of this path, because the deeper we go, the less we deal in fear, and the more we deal in the truth that reorganizes everything. Part 5. The urge to surrender at the gate. There is a specific, cruel trick of the psyche that you will encounter every single time you attempt a genuine transformation. You rarely want to quit when you are miles away from the finish line. You want to quit when you are inches from it. This is the no man's land of the soul, the in-between. The old country is behind you, but the new shore is not yet visible through the mist. You are treading water in the middle of the ocean at midnight. And in that state, the desire to give up doesn't arrive as a tantrum. It arrives dressed in a suit and tie, speaking perfect logic. It says, "This is unsustainable. Look at the data. Turn back. At least you knew how to survive back there. This is just self-indulgence." It sounds like wisdom, but Jung would identify this voice as the ego in a state of mortal panic. The ego does not fear pain as much as it fears the unknown. We think we want freedom from suffering. But if you look closely, humans will cling to a familiar agony with white knuckles rather than step into an unfamiliar peace. A person will stay in a dynamic that is slowly eroding their spirit for a decade, simply because they have learned the rhythm of that particular misery. They know when the blow is coming. They know how to brace. But the threshold of real change is always uncharted. It forces you to let go of the old railing before you can see the new staircase. To the ego, this is indistinguishable from death. That is why right before the breakthrough, people experience a very distinct flavor of fatigue. You are too depleted to keep living the old way, but you are too scared to commit to the new way. You no longer believe in the old lies, but the new truth hasn't solidified into a reliable foundation yet. You are suspended. The old shore is a memory. The new shore is a myth. And in that darkness, the mind becomes a brilliant negotiator. It doesn't scream surrender. It whispers, "Rest here. Just for a little while. Go back to what you know. It wasn't that bad. You're just making things complicated." Jung knew this territory intimately. He knew that the path of individuation, the path to wholeness, is not a straight line upward. It dips into the underworld. It loops back. It gets lost. In that transitional fog, the soul is like a house being renovated from the studs up. And the natural human reaction when the walls come down is to run back to the old condemned structure, just to get out of the cold. Some people run back to a toxic relationship because the emptiness of the new, healthy solitude feels like a vacuum. Some drown themselves in busy work because the silence of their own soul is too loud. Some numb themselves with old vices just to stop the internal construction noise. All of it stems from the same terror. If I keep going, I will cease to be recognizable to myself. Maybe you've seen this in someone you love. They spend years in therapy, learning to set boundaries, learning to stop abandoning themselves. And then, in the exact moment they are about to speak their first true word of refusal to a controlling figure, they are flooded with guilt. They want to crawl back into the cage of being agreeable, not because it's right, but because it's home. Or someone lives under the weight of a family narrative their whole life. And when the door to freedom finally cracks open, an opportunity to leave, to live differently. They sabotage it. They pick a fight. They find a reason to stay stuck. Why? Because freedom is terrifying. Freedom means you no longer have an excuse. It means you are now responsible for your own life, and that is a weight that makes the old chains feel like a security blanket. This is also a physiological event. Your nervous system does not care about your spiritual growth. It cares about predictability. It learned its pathways early. When I am quiet, I am safe. When I am loud, I am punished. When I anticipate needs, I am loved. When you start living differently, your body interprets the change as a threat. Your heart races when you speak your truth, not because it's wrong, but because it's new. You feel empty when you stop chasing validation, not because you need validation, but because your nervous system is in withdrawal from a familiar chemical cycle. And here is the final reason you want to quit at the gate. There are no receipts, no guarantees. The ego is a transactional creature. It wants a contract. If I do this shadow work, how long until I'm happy? If I leave this situation, when does the perfect replacement arrive? If I become real, will I be loved? But the soul does not operate on a fee-for-service model. It asks you to move forward not because you've seen the entire staircase, but because something in your gut knows that turning back is a spiritual suicide. So if you feel the pull to give up right now, to go back to sleep, to retreat into the familiar fog, do not mistake that impulse for a lack of strength. That impulse is often the clearest indicator that you are standing on the very edge of the old world. The ego only fights this hard when its regime is genuinely threatened. You are not exhausted because the path is wrong. You are exhausted because you are in the labor of becoming. And the transition between contractions is the moment the mind screams, I can't. But it is precisely in that dark interval where so many souls turn back for one more round of the familiar misery that you have the chance to hold steady, to not betray yourself one more time. And what feels like the end is simply the wall of the womb you are about to break through. Part 6. The Alchemy of Integration. There is a pervasive lie in the world of self-improvement that says the goal is to become pure light, to vanquish the darkness, to become a creature of only peace, love, and high-vibration thoughts. Jung saw this as not only impossible, but profoundly dangerous. He understood that the brighter the light you try to project, the longer the shadow you cast behind you. The attempt to become purely good in a superficial sense only drives the darkness deeper underground, where it festers and eventually erupts in ways you cannot control. The real work, the mature work, is not the annihilation of the shadow. It is the integration of the shadow. And integration requires a level of honesty that most people would rather avoid. It means acknowledging that you are not a two-dimensional angel. Within you are wild, messy, and even ugly territories. There is jealousy. There is a lust for control. There is pettiness. There are cowardly fears. There are thoughts that, if broadcast on a screen, would make you want to disappear. And it is precisely from the moment you dare to see these things as psychological data, rather than moral failures, that the healing actually begins. Let's get one thing clear immediately. Integration is not a license for bad behavior. It does not mean you get to scream at people because you're expressing your anger. It does not mean you justify selfishness by calling it boundaries. Jung was not advocating for a surrender to instinct. He was pointing out a simple, brutal truth. What you resist persists, and what you deny gains power over you. The energy trapped inside the shadow is not just poison. It is often life force that has been twisted out of shape. Anger, when brought into the light of consciousness, becomes the capacity for firm, clear boundaries. It is the energy that says, this far and no further. Jealousy, when examined honestly, can reveal a roadmap to what you deeply long for, but have been too afraid to pursue. A need for control, once understood, can point to an ancient fear of chaos that was never soothed. The desire to be seen, once it stops hiding behind shame, can become a powerful creative drive. In other words, the shadow contains the gold. It contains the parts of you that were too powerful, too wild, or too vulnerable for the environment you grew up in. Integration is the process of reclaiming that frozen energy. But integrating the shadow is unpleasant because it demands that you give up a very specific addiction. The addiction to being the right one in every story. To integrate, you must stop telling a one-sided narrative about your life. You must accept that you are not only a victim. You are not only the one who was wronged. Sometimes, you were the one who wounded. Sometimes, you manipulated. Sometimes, you envied a friend's success because it made you feel small. These truths make the ego want to slam the door and lock it forever. But Jung knew that the place where the ego feels the most shame is the exact location where wholeness begins. Because you cannot be whole if you are only living in the clean, well-lit rooms of the house. You have to open the basement door. And when you do, you discover something unexpected: compassion. Once you have seen the complexity and the contradiction within yourself, you stop judging others with such superficial harshness. You look at the controlling boss and you see a terrified child afraid of failure. You look at the angry stranger and you see a person drowning in vulnerability they were never allowed to show. You look at the cold, distant partner and you see layers of scar tissue. This does not mean you become a doormat. It means you stop being naive about human nature. You are no longer shocked by the darkness because you've met your own. And strangely, the more you integrate your own shadow, the less power other people's shadows have over you. You stop being triggered as easily because you are no longer carrying a disowned piece of yourself that their behavior is hooking into. You stop demanding perfection from yourself. And when you stop demanding perfection from yourself, you finally stop demanding it from the world. From that space, a different kind of steadiness emerges. Not the rigid steadiness of armor, but the rooted steadiness of a tree that has learned to grow around the rocks in the soil. You have walked through your own dark forest without a flashlight, and you came out the other side, not unscathed, but whole. So integrating the shadow is not a side quest, it is the main event. You are not healed by embracing only the lovable, Instagram-worthy parts of yourself. You are healed when you dare to turn toward the ugly, chaotic, shame-drenched parts and say, I see you. You are mine. But you will no longer drive this car from the back seat in the dark. That is the moment power returns to the conscious self. And it is the moment the inner war begins to end. The darkness stops being an abyss to be feared and becomes a wilderness to be explored. Not so it can be made pretty, but so that from the very place that once seemed most cursed, a new current of life can begin to flow. Conclusion: the stillness after the storm. And perhaps, after all of this, after the descent, the confrontation, and the integration, the deepest thing this journey leaves you with is not a sense of triumph. It is a profound stillness in the center of the chest. A quiet that is not the result of avoiding life, but the result of no longer running from yourself. At some point, you will realize that what you were chasing all along was never found in becoming bulletproof. It was never found in the applause of the crowd or the validation of those who barely know you. It is found in the moment when you can stand alone in your own skin, without performing, without contorting, without seeking anyone's permission to simply be. The surface of the ocean may still be rough. There will still be days of fog and fatigue. There will still be questions that have no immediate answers. But from now on, you will walk on a different kind of ground. Not the shifting sand of fear and approval, but the bedrock of your own truth. And from that place, a life that is deeper, quieter, and no longer so easily stolen from you will begin to open. If you have stayed with me through this entire journey, you are among the few who do not turn away from the heat of the forge. Thank you for your attention. It is a rare thing. If this has served you, let it be known. And if you are ready for more, the door remains open.